Well, thank you, Noel and Carlos. Can you hear me and can you see the initial slide?
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for joining us, the audience, and welcome. This is my office at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric institution in the District of Columbia that is going to be 170 years old next year, an old place. This talk that we are presenting today is really part of a course that Dr. Gandhi and I have put together for IWP on the behavioral sciences in national security and public safety. The course is ready to go, and hopefully there will be some takers in the fall. This is also a program that we have put together in collaboration with the Washington Psychiatric Society and the World Psychiatric Association Conflict Management, Conflict Resolution section that we are part of. But for me, this is essentially a tribute to an extraordinary international civil servant and negotiator, Giandomenico Picco, who recently passed away in March. And to honor his work, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Voice of America, the Associated Press, and a number of other media outlets published articles when he passed away. And indeed, his story deserves to be told and known. So the first part of my talk here is really a profile of Gianni Picco that is based on his autobiographical book, Man Without a Gun, published in 1999. As an assistant for political affairs to the UN Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar, Gianni Picco negotiated the end of the Soviet Afghanistan war and the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. He also negotiated the end of the Iran-Iraq war and also the rescue of Western hostages in Lebanon. In the second part of my talk, I'm going to use some of his insights and pivot to discussing international relations and peacemaking from a psychological perspective. And this will be based on The Fog of Peace and the Human Face of Conflict Resolution, a book that Picco and the psychotherapist Gabrielle Rifkind published. And I will briefly introduce the concept of multi-track diplomacy and track two diplomacy, and talk about the past involvement of the the American Psychiatric Association in track two diplomacy processes. And I will make the case that psychiatrists who are interested in international affairs have something useful to offer in terms of advice to policymakers and subject matter experts. So it's nighttime in Beirut. It's August 10, 1991. Gianni Picco, as an envoy of the UN Secretary General, is at the embassy of Iran in Beirut that night. The Iranians have arranged for him to meet with the groups who are holding Western hostages. His mission is to negotiate with the kidnappers the release of the hostages. And that night he will have the first of several meetings with these groups. And it's been made very clear to him by the Iranian diplomats that it's going to be between him, Picco, and them, the groups. There's not going to be anybody else. and that the process requires some formalities. So what happens next is that he's left outside the gates of the embassy with no further instruction. He sees a man in a distance and instinctively starts walking towards this man. And when he approaches the man walks away, but remains close enough to indicate that he wants to be followed. There are no words exchanged, and this goes on for a few minutes. Eventually, a car arrives at high speed, stops, and the people in the car shout at the UN envoy, Gianni Picco, to not look at them. They shove him in the back seat. They force his head down to the floor. And it's all very inconvenient for a man who's 6'4". So the car drives through checkpoints, eventually stops, is pulled from that car, thrust into another car. And after another drive, the second car stops, a hood is slid over his head, and he's taken to a room where he meets with two individuals who are themselves masked. They are wearing ski masks, and there are other people in the rooms who are armed. One of them will do all the talking, introducing himself with a nom de guerre, not the real name. But Picco will come to realize later that these two individuals were probably Imad Mughniye and his brother-in-law Mustafa Badreddin, who were leaders of the security apparatus of Hezbollah, and as such managed the kidnapping operations. This was at the end of the Lebanese civil war. During the Lebanese civil war, over 17,000 people have been estimated to be abducted and disappear, including approximately 100 foreign hostages, most of them Westerners. The hostage operation, the hostage rescue operation that he is executing focuses on 11 hostages. 7 are Americans, 2 from the UK, and 2 from Germany. And their names I have listed here. Now, they will all be freed. There will be no ransom paid, and the total cost for the United Nations for manning almost year-long operation will be $150,000 approximately. Now, the U.S. Quota should be 25% of this UN expense, but really that money will be charged to a separate fund, a private fund donated to the UN Secretary General's office by an elderly American woman in the 1980s. The point that Picco makes is that this didn't cost anything to the American taxpayer. Well, and at the end of this operation, the Presidential Award for Exceptional Service will be given to Gianni Picco by President Bush, the 41st president, and placed on him by Mrs. Bush. The mission is primarily about freeing hostages, but not only. That's not the only objective. It also involves recovering bodies, or at least forensic evidence, or finding proof of life of a number of individuals who are missing in actions, prisoners of war, and some of them I have listed here, and you see their pictures. It is also about liberating other individuals who are detained in different countries, or at least having access to them in prisons, or improving their conditions of detainment. And I have listed some here, and you see their pictures. Now, the objectives and tasks for Picco keep changing in those months. There is a lot of inventorying and packaging and repackaging that goes on as the operation unfolds. There are multiple quid pro quo and reciprocities. The UN channel is just one of a number of channels that are more or less activated to free the hostages. There are multiple players involved in this complex game in the Middle East, in America, and in Europe. And of course, there are complications all the time. There are rogue intermediaries, rumors, the media intrudes. Also, Picco is operating on a time crunch, and that's because his boss, the UN Secretary General, Perez de Cuellar, is stepping down at the end of that year, 1991. And so a new Secretary General will be in charge come 1992, and may very well have different priorities, plans, people he wants to work with. So there is little time left, and this is a de facto one-man operation. And he's putting his skin in the operation. And he keeps it a secret from almost everybody, including his family. No one in his office at the UN headquarters knows what he's doing when he's absent and absent from the office, and that's often the case. No one except the UN Secretary General and Picco's own administrative assistant, who usually books 3 flights at a time for him, and he himself at the airport last minute cancels 2 of the 3 flights and gets on the one that he intends to have. So who is this Gianni Picco? What's his story? Well, of all places, he comes from a little village in the Eastern Alps of Italy, the Italian province of Udine, right here. You know, a place where, as he grows up, about half of the people are Catholics and half of communists. And that's not an uncommon scenario in the Cold War Italy, the 2 churches. Place that geographically is much closer to Austria and the countries of the former Yugoslavia. Place that has seen in its history empires and kingdoms, a melting pot of ethnicities. He studies, it goes for undergrad to Padua, old university, studies political science. Then for grad school, he goes to UC Santa Barbara with a Fulbright scholarship. And then goes back to Europe for postgrad European studies in Prague and Amsterdam. And right out of school in 1973 applies and to the UN and is hired and joins the UN at the lowest rank and is assigned to the Political and Security Council Affairs Department, which at the time is known as nicknamed Soviet Department because a Soviet individual citizen is always in charge, and that's part of the Cold War arrangements at the UN. As he says, he's young, he's inexperienced, and he's expendable, and therefore is given an impossible task. The task is to create a daily digest of the international press, and that's really a thankless job because no matter what he does, no matter how he words things, the topics that he chooses, there will be people complaining, the pro-Soviet side, the pro-Western side will complain. So he has this thankless job for over 2 years, but he learned some useful lessons, for example, about the politics of terminology and also the reality of living under some kind of surveillance, being potentially subject to blackmailing and recruitment by intelligence agencies. But his aspirations are definitely higher, and he has joined the UN and chosen to become an international civil servant because he wants to make a larger contribution, both in intellectual and practical terms. So he's able to move to the UN Office of Political Affairs that is in charge of the peacekeeping operations. And this department in its early decades was led and staffed by legends like Brian Urquhart and Ralph Bunche, who he mentions in his book. Picco is assigned, is sent to Cyprus, and there he acts as a mediator in the conflict between Greeks and Turks. And he will spend there a good part of the following years, learning the ropes of international mediation, really dealing with people's everyday life and problems under the circumstances. He will consider that a mission a failure in the end, but with some important lessons. For example, that credibility and accountability are key and individuals come first, and that pride can prevail over money, and that 90% of diplomacy is about who blinks first. But another very consequential fact of those years is that he forms a close professional and personal relationship with his boss at the time, who is Perez de Cuellar. And Perez de Cuellar in 1981 becomes the UN Secretary General. And Picco will continue to work with him, and he will continue to be his boss, but obviously at a much higher level. And so the dossier entrusted to Picco by Secretary General Perez de Cuellar include negotiating the end of the Soviet-Afghanistan war, the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and later on there will be the hostage crisis in Lebanon. In Afghanistan, Picco learned some useful skills because he likes carpets, and he goes often to the bazaar, and he learns to bargain in a bazaar. He also acquires high quality socio-political insights from an unexpected source, the chaplain of the Italian embassy, Don Angelo Panigatti, who had spent decades in Afghanistan, learning the languages, getting to know the people and the tribal realities. Afghanistan will be mission accomplished for Picco when the Geneva Agreements sanction the withdrawal of the Soviet Union in 1988. And that's all based on guidelines that initially he had jotted down on airline stationery back in 1982. So his lines will become paragraphs and then chapters, and that will be the end of the Soviet Union Afghanistan war. This, he says in his book, is peacemaking, UN peacemaking, and it's best. There are no money and weapons to offer. It's about using intermediaries, practicing the shadow diplomacy, a la Ralph Bunche. Ralph Bunche, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1950 for his mediation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's about pursuing pragmatic solutions, if needed, in unconventional ways, but never by upstaging governments and authorities. The Iran-Iraq war is the next dossier for Picco, and this also will be a success story. This bloody war starts in 1981, and after many attempts, the UN Security Council in 1987 passes a resolution to end the war. But the resolution does not go into effect, and the war goes on. And so the UN Secretary General, Perez de Cuellar, asks Picco, beginning of 1988, to come up with some new ideas. And a good lead materializes weeks after that, when Picco reads an interview given by the Saudi defense minister, who signals the country's, Saudi Arabia's, fatigue with that war. Now, this is a very important signal, because the Saudi kingdom is the banker of Saddam Hussein. And so Picco thinks in historical terms. He goes back to the Renaissance and thinks about the role of bankers in funding wars. And therefore, he has the idea to negotiate the ceasefire between Iran and Iraq by having the Saudis as the proxy of the intractable Saddam Hussein. And so on August 8, 1988, Resolution 598 becomes effective. There is a ceasefire. And there is an important paragraph there paragraph 6, that I will mention later because it is important in the hostage crisis in Lebanon, which is the next dossier, the hostage rescue operation in Lebanon. Now, Picco's idea is that the key player here who may lead to rescue the hostages in Lebanon is actually Iran, because Iran created and sponsored in South Lebanon the Party of God, Hezbollah, which is an umbrella organization under which operate those groups involved in the kidnapping and hostage taking in Lebanon. So as usual, the UN Secretary General does not have any money or weapons to offer to anybody, but there is credibility as currency. And the credibility comes precisely from having successfully negotiated the end of the Iran-Iraq war. And Picco realizes that he has two cards to play with the Iranians. The first comes from that paragraph 6 that I have here on this slide. And, paragraph 6 of Resolution 598 is about having an inquiry into the responsibility of the Iran-Iraq war, an inquiry to establish who's responsible of the two countries for having started that war. And Picco suggests to the Iranians that three wise professors will look into this matter and will likely find that Iraq was the culprit. And he knows how important this historical justice is for the Iranians to establish that Iraq was the aggressor. So that's the first card that he thinks he can play. The second card comes from a paragraph in the 1989 inaugural address of the 41st US President, George Bush. Picco points out to the Iranians that President Bush mentioned in his inaugural speech the American hostages held in Lebanon and called for Iran's attention, stating, "Goodwill begets goodwill. Goodwill begets goodwill. So if you do something good may come." So that's his second card. With these two cards in his hands, for Picco, it is game on. And it will be a lot of a lot of shadow diplomacy in the following months. Now, his idea is to go to the sponsors first, like he did with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Therefore, he will go to Beirut, but coming from the east, from Tehran and Damascus. And it will go to Israel, but coming from Washington, from the west. So to Beirut from the east, he says, to Israel from the west. The Iranian president at the time is Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. He's the scion of a wealthy merchant family. And Picco thinks of Rafsanjani as, he's not a cleric, he doesn't have a beard, he comes from a wealthy family of merchants, he's a pragmatic person. Also, Picco has an understanding of the inner workings of Iranian politics. For example, the importance of religious authorities and how they influence different centers of power. Also, it's very important his understanding of the historical reality, centuries-old ties between Shia authorities in Persia and South Lebanon. The connections between these clerics that are personal and theological are very important, where they did their religious studies, who were their teachers, their mentors, who's close to whom, who's not close to whom. And it all matters because these clerics have powerful influence on the political and military operatives. So with all this background work and understanding, and to make a very long story short, the hostage rescue operation is a success. It results in 11 Western hostages freed with no ransom paid. It also results in 99 Lebanese prisoners freed from Israel. But also the bodies of Lieutenant Colonel William Higgins and the former CIA chief of station in Beirut, William Buckley, returned. Their remains are returned to the U.S. Other remains and forensic evidence are produced, and this is just part of what he accomplishes in these months. And Iran does get the favorable UN report that attributes the responsibility of the Iran-Iraq war to Iraq. Goodwill begets goodwill. Well, eventually, the national security advisor of President Bush, Scowcroft, is not able to offer anything because of the political circumstances. Well, Gianni Picco is recognized as a giant in the field of international negotiation. And sprinkled around in his writings are many pearls of wisdom, and I have collected some on these in the next slide, and we'll quickly go over them. The human factor is the basis of crisis. The individual is the source of solution. This quote is in the title of my talk today, but is also an inspiration for me and for Dr. Gandhi in putting together the course that we will offer at IWP. This means that bureaucracy tend to be slow to react, they're stuck in precedents, and that is why individuals should be chosen over institutions, aiming at personal commitments. But you have to understand what really matters to the individual, to the other, know where they're coming from and where they want to go, where they think they're going. Nothing happens in reality according to plans. You're always picking up threads and weaving. You have to stay off the radar screen as much as possible. You're always running against time, and the operations unfold on the jobs, not in the books that you read. Negotiators have to be prepared to act in unconventional and adaptive ways. They have to be semantic acrobats, but always credible and accountable. They will take calculated risks, and there is always an irrational aspect in what happens. There are strong emotions and changes that cannot be foreseen. It's like a matryoshka. There are negotiations within negotiations. International negotiators should never embarrass or upstage the authorities. And remember that pride can win over money, and power politics often prevail over any other consideration. And know about the human species' existential necessity to have enemies, to create enemies. Difference is often seen as a threat in this mindset. Instead, it could be and it should be the essence of growth. Now, peacemaking for Picco is life at its peak. That's how he ends his book. The word peak, Picco is his last name, but is also a word that an Italian word that translates peak. So it's a word pun. But there is a personal price to pay, and he says that in a prologue of his book, where he apologizes to his son because he was an absent father for extended periods of time due to his work. And after an emotional climax, life usually goes downhill, says Picco, and individuals must accept their responsibilities for defeat, and they have to know when it's time to leave. Things change at the UN, and Picco knows that it's time to leave, and he resigns in 1992, becomes an international consultant, an author, and he published the book that I've used for this profile in 1999, Man Without a Gun. In 2014, he co-authors The Fog of Peace with Gabrielle Rifkind, and they combined his diplomatic experience with the psychological expertise of Dr. Rifkind. And the book highlights the importance of personal and collective narratives in international relations. These are mental constructs that stem from a combination of collective and personal histories. The psychological mindsets of those involved in conflicts have to be understood as the product of history and culture, as well as personal experiences. The two authors maintain that war is perpetuated by the failure to manage the humiliation of defeat. The people who live in conflict look for safety blankets. They take on collective identities that can be ethnic, religious, cultural, ideological. They renounce their individualities in exchange for the sense of safety, the false sense of safety that comes from these collective identities. Civilized societies are governed by laws. There are systems of arbitration, reconciliation, in order for citizens to coexist. But in conditions of tension, heightened tension, we're driven by rigid beliefs about identity and survival. And as part of large groups, we become consumed by the histories of the groups. We identify with collective earlier traumas, which the psychoanalyst Vamid Volkan has referred to as chosen traumas. The baggage that people carry, this baggage matters when they make decisions. And that's this kind of baggage that does not allow opponents to see a negotiator as impartial, no matter what the negotiator does. So according to Picco, impartiality and neutrality are illusory concepts in international negotiation. Credibility instead is the key. A negotiator has to act as an honest broker, and most important, has to deliver what's been promised. Conflict is more likely to be resolved when the geopolitical complexity is placed in a bed of human relationship. According to Hans Blix, the Swedish diplomat, conflict resolution should be served at the kitchen table. So not the dining room, the kitchen table. While maintaining awareness of geopolitical structures and power politics, and knowing that politics is not therapy, will never be therapy. But still, human motivations and emotions should be part of the equation, of the strategic equation. And we should learn to empathize, which doesn't mean appeasement. Empathy does not mean appeasement, doesn't mean sympathy, doesn't mean locking in, doesn't mean agreeing with the other. It means understanding where the other is coming from instead. So the field of conflict resolution originated in the mid-20th century. In 1981, Dr. William Davidson, who was a psychiatrist, and Joseph Monfield, who was a U.S. American Foreign Service officer, wrote a seminal article on foreign policy. And they introduced in writing the term and the concept of track 2 diplomacy. They described it as unofficial, informal interaction between members of adversarial groups of nations with the goals of developing strategies, influencing public opinion, and organizing human and material resources in ways that might help resolve the conflict. So track 2 diplomacy. In 1996, Louis Diamond and Jacques MacDonald developed the concept of multi-track diplomacy. And they identified 9 tracks to engage governmental and non-governmental actors in peacemaking activities. Another term that is used by analysts is the track 1.5 diplomacy, also known as a back channel, which describes situations where official and non-official actors cooperate in conflict management, operating under the instructions of government officials. So are these multi-track, track 2 diplomacy just freelance, feel-good exercises, or can they deliver unconventional solutions in unusual situations? Well, this is how track 2 diplomacy works. There are open-minded, unofficial, altruistic, unofficial representatives and third parties who run small, informal dialogues. These are problem-solving workshops. These people step back, the people who participate step back from their country's official positions to an extent and jointly explore underlying causes and alternative ideas, while maintaining access to official decision makers. These are ongoing processes. They're not one-time events. They're not really secret, but they're quiet. And the thinking is outside the box. And new approaches are discussed not only between the groups, but also within the groups. And so the participants are trying to change the perception of the other group, but they are also to an extent open to changing their own perspectives. And the psychological aspects of the disputes are addressed. This is a way to open new channels of communication, identify and develop new options for future official negotiations. Networks of influential people are developed the goal is always to prepare the ground for the transition of the ideas to track one, to the official track of diplomacy, government to government. So these are laboratories to test ideas, policies, especially where the official routes are blocked. Example is the work done by the American Association for the Advancement of Science in preparation of the Oslo Accords between Israelis and Palestinians in 1993. In 1931, Albert Einstein, as part of an initiative of the League of Nations, wrote an open letter to Sigmund Freud asking why there is war, warum Krieg, why war? And Freud's response was kind of lukewarm. He said, well, aggressive instincts are inherent to the human condition. But Freud also thought that aggressive instincts can be redirected, right, and diverted. In 1969, Senator William Fulbright, known around the world for the Fulbright Scholarship, as chairman of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, held a series of hearings on the psychological aspects of foreign policy. And he stated, at some point, it is believed by many that wars start in the mind of man. Yet an examination of the human mind to understand our own political behavior has not appealed to either the public or political leaders. It may be that we are frightened by the possibility that might be revealed by some self-examination. In 1977, in a historical turn of events, the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat addressed the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and he stated, there remains another wall. This wall constitutes a psychological barrier between us, a barrier of suspicion, rejection, fear, deception. And he went on to say that that psychological barrier is really 70% of the problem. That's what he said. In 1969, the American Psychiatric Association established a task force, small task force on psychiatry and foreign affairs. It was chaired by Dr. William Davidson, who I've already mentioned. Subsequently, the task force became a standing committee and remained active through the 1980s. It focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also other world conflicts. The World Psychiatric Association was founded after the end of World War II. German and French psychiatrists contributed to its foundation. People from countries that had been at war during World War II. Fittingly, in 1990, the WPA Conflict Management and Conflict Resolution section was created after the end of the Cold War. As a psychiatrist interested in world politics, it would be very interesting to contribute to developing psychologically minded, empathetic approaches to international relations, and to be able to offer advice to the subject matters experts of diplomacy and statecraft, for example, in the context of track to diplomacy processes. No question, no doubt that conflict is part of the human condition. It's ubiquitous, it's universal, it's intrapersonal, it's interpersonal. It manifests in its national and international. And particularly in the international arena, it manifests in brutal forms. Cannot be negated, this fact, or avoided. But conflict can be ameliorated, and that's where the hope is. And, to conclude here, I will just say that, from psychiatry, psychologists, these are not grandiose dreams. We will never be the diplomats, the negotiators, the policymakers, but we can act as advisors and facilitators. And we should go light on theory because that's not what really interests the diplomats and the negotiators. And we can do that because we are hands-on, down-to-earth people who are confronted every day with the humbling reality of doing clinical work, working in healthcare systems, and we are doers. We meet our patients and challenges where they are. And we have a toolkit that includes de-escalation, active listening techniques, and really this concept of empathy. So with this, this is just the new course at IWP that will start in the fall, and I pass this on to Dr. Gandhi for his remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Suardi. I would like to briefly highlight a peace negotiation that I believe to be timely and useful to review with regards to the role of psychological factors in negotiations. That is the 1978 Camp David Accords mediated by President Carter that led to a landmark peace deal between Egypt's Anwar el-Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin. These were two countries that had fought two wars and had so much to gain from peace. The structure of the Camp David summit and diplomatic mechanisms utilized during the summit were unique and evolved throughout the process as various political and interpersonal factors came to light for President Carter. In the lead up to Camp David, Henry Kissinger had admonished Carter not to start a negotiation whose outcome is highly in doubt. Typically, negotiations at the presidential level are highly organized, focused, with clear goals in mind. In the case of Camp David, the principals involved all came to the table pursuing different goals. Begin believed the talks would last 3 or 4 days and would only serve as a stepping stone to future talks. Sadat, on the other hand, saw himself as leader of the Arab world and, similar to Carter, wanted a grand bargain that involved full withdrawal of military and civilian presence in the Sinai, which was taken from Egypt by Israel, withdrawal of settlements from the Gaza and West Bank, final determination of the status of Jerusalem, and normalization of diplomatic relations between Israel and Egypt. Carter initially saw his role as that of facilitator between Begin and Sadat. He felt that Sadat and Begin would come to trust each other in the closed environment, and Carter had faith that the two men would come to see that peace would benefit their two countries more than war. Within the first 2 days of the conference, it became starkly clear that proximity was no enzyme for rapport building between Begin and Sadat. Talks were on the verge of breakdown shortly into the summit, and Kissinger's warning may have appeared prescient. A shouting match between Begin and Sadat that occurred early in the summit illustrates this, with Sadat yelling, "Security, yes, land, no," with regards to the wrangling over the Sinai. Carter had to shift into taking a much more active role in the process. In this regard, Carter's fastidiousness may have saved the summit, as the Israeli and Egyptian delegations regularly clashed over the key issues. To start, Carter had done his homework. Not only was he familiar with the geography of the region as well as its biblical and political histories, but he had also asked the intelligence community to produce psychological profiles of the leaders in question to aid in negotiation, in addition to political and biographical profiles. Dr. Gerald Post, a psychiatrist with the CIA at the time, was a key member of the intelligence community who helped architect the Camp David personality profiles. In his now declassified work, he notes that political action or behavior is likely to move forward when political and psychological factors meet. He further notes that, quote, "It is during unstructured negotiations among world leaders from different cultures with different perceptions, values, and attitudes that psychological variables would more heavily influence the outcome of a proceeding," end quote. President Carter's assessment of the Camp David profiles was clear. quote, "After spending 13 days with the two principals, I wouldn't change a thing," end quote. Interestingly, Anwar el-Sadat himself also noted that, quote, 70% of the conflict between Israel and the Arabs was psychological. In the Camp David profiles, Menachem Begin is described as tending towards rigidity and oppositionality, while Sadat was variously described as having a, quote, Barbara Walters complex or, quote, Nobel Prize complex. Begin was focused on semantic detail and held a strong religious and ideological vision regarding Israel's past and future. He viewed Jerusalem as the capital of Israel rather than an internationally administered city. He took exception to the idea of land for peace as outlined in UN Resolution 242, which stated that land cannot be taken through offensive wars. Begin viewed the 4 Arab-Israeli wars as defensive, including the preemptive and most recent of those wars, the Yom Kippur War. On the issue that proved to be most difficult to resolve, the presence of Israeli settlements in the Sinai, Begin was quite resolute and tenacious. He insisted on formal attire, while President Carter hoped that the scenic and verdant Camp David would encourage informal attire and an environment conducive to collaboration and friendship. Carter regularly invoked Sadat's wish to be seen as an important historical figure when talks reached an impasse. With regards to Begin, Carter knew that wording and detail were essential. Carter and the American delegation worked tirelessly to write and rewrite draft agreements with careful wordsmithing. In contrast to Begin, Sadat was focused on the quote-unquote big picture and was very disinterested in line-by-line detail. Begin had more of a need for control on a granular level, while Sadat focused on long-range goals. Sadat dreamt of leadership from childhood, and to connect with him, Carter leaned more into a gut feeling, and a sense of trust and friendship was developed. With Begin, Carter utilized logic, kept awareness for Begin's penchant for legalism, and utilized other pathways discussed ahead. The special circumstances of Camp David allowed President Carter to utilize a variety of tools of diplomacy to manage the several negotiating crises that arose. To elaborate, the leaders and delegations from each country were essentially sequestered throughout the 13-day process, which allowed each delegation to be less constrained by domestic politics. The open-ended nature of Camp David allowed an evolution of tactics. As noted above, Carter started off as mediator or facilitator between Begin and Sadat, but soon realized the two leaders could hardly be present in the same room without a breakdown in communication, as predicted by Dr. Post's personality assessments. He then changed strategy, keeping Begin and Sadat from ever being alone together, and Carter himself shuttled between the delegations. The American delegation took charge of creating the draft document, and Carter himself wrote and rewrote several forms of the draft after each round of his Kissinger-esque shuttle diplomacy. Moreover, the enclosed nature of the negotiations, a true camp, gave birth to a variety of types of back channels. In addition to talking with Begin and Carter directly, Carter regularly negotiated with subordinates of the Israeli and Egyptian delegations. On the issue of Israeli settlements in the Egyptian Sinai, for example, Carter knew that Israeli Defense Minister Ezer Weizman, Israeli Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan, and Israeli Legal Counsel Ahoran Barak were all moderate on the issue of the Sinai settlements and regularly would liaison with them at times in the absence of Begin. And so little by little, with the use of these psychological variables and structures such as back channels as well as political strategy, of course, an agreement was forged. But not without drama even at the 11th hour. Long story short, toward the end of the conference, while much progress had been made, settling the issue of the Sinai remained a hang-up. Begin was ready to walk. Carter asked his assistant to contact Israel and personalize the postcards Begin had requested for his family with the names of each of Begin's children. As Carter handed the cards to Begin, Begin read the names of each of his grandchildren one by one, and both men had tears in their eyes and stated they should try again. And eventually an agreement was reached. Thank you. That concludes my brief highlight of the Camp David Accords. Much of the information I presented was sourced from an excellent book, 13 Days in September by Lawrence Wright, which I highly recommend. With that, I'll turn it back to Dr. Suardi, and we can open the floor for questions if there are any.
We have time to take 1 or 2 questions if anybody wants to put them in the Q&A.
I will just say that the psychological profiles of Sadat and Begin had been prepared already in 1977, and then Carter wanted to have a meeting early 1978. And so it was not just Dr. Post and his group, the Center for the Analysis of Personality and Political Behavior at CIA, but there were also other stakeholders for the Department of State. And that's where they really came together and realized that these two men, Sadat and Begin, were not really compatible because of what Dr. Gandhi said. So they were prepared for that kind of situation, and it's all publicly available on the CIA website. Also, there is an article that Gerald Post published in Studies in Intelligence that is also publicly available.
It doesn't appear that we have questions in the Q&A, and it looks like we're just right at time. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'd like to thank Dr. Enrico Suardi and Dr. Baiju Gandhi, and all of you who joined us online. For those interested in learning more about our courses or applying to study at IWP, please visit us at iwp.edu. One final announcement I'd like to make before we go. The Institute of World Politics 2024 Gala event will be hosted on Wednesday, October 9th at the Library of Congress. Tickets are currently available at iwp.edu/events. I hope to see you all there, and thank you for joining.